There is a rod on a listing right now for $39, and 40 feet away, behind glass, a rod that costs $200. Everybody walks up to those two price tags and asks the same question. Which one is the ripoff? I am going to tell you that is the wrong question, and that the wall is very happy you keep asking it. I have guided freshwater for a long time. I have put a rod in the hands of a nervous kid, and a rod in the hands of a tournament stick, on the same dock, on the same morning. And here is what all those years taught me. The $39 rod and the $200 rod usually are not a cheap version and a good version of the same thing. They are two different tools, built for two different anglers, and nobody ever taught you how to tell which one was built for you. That is the real reason the price question has no clean answer. Sometimes that $200 is buying you something you will feel on every single cast, and sometimes it is buying you nothing your fishing will ever use. The only way to know, the only way, is to be able to read the rod yourself. And in the next 20 minutes I am going to teach you to do exactly that, in about 10 seconds flat, standing right there at the wall. Here is the part that explains why nobody at that wall will ever do it for you. Reading a rod is the one thing the tackle industry cannot sell you. You cannot patent it. You cannot seal it in a blister pack. You cannot sell it back to a man every spring in a fresh color. A buyer who can read a rod buys fewer rods, the right ones, and keeps them for years. A confused buyer buys a whole wall. So the confusion is not a bug in the system. For the people selling, the confusion is the product. You have felt this engine work on you. Walk that wall and you will be told, gently, that you need one rod for worms, another for crankbaits, another for topwater, another for jigs, a different stick for every way you might tie on a lure. Some of that is real. Most of it is a business model. A man who believes he needs 8 rods buys 8 rods. A man who can read power and action buys the 2 or 3 that actually cover his water and walks out with the rest of his money still in his pocket. Only one of those 2 men is good for a quarterly sales number, and it is not the one who understands what he is holding. 2 words on a rod tell you almost everything you need. The industry prints them right on the blank, just above the handle, and then never explains them. We start with the one that decides whether the rod can even fight your fish. Think of a fishing rod as a spring. A light spring for light work, a heavy spring for heavy work. Power is just the industry's word for how big a load that spring is built to handle before it gives out. It runs from ultralight, through light, medium, and medium heavy, all the way up to heavy and beyond. Here is what that word means with a fish on the line. Power is matched to 2 things, the weight of what you are throwing and the size of what you are fighting. An ultralight rod is a whippy little spring, perfect for a tiny jig and a bluegill, and useless for dragging a bass out of heavy cover because the spring gives out long before the fish does. A heavy rod is the opposite, a stiff spring that will winch a big fish out of a brush pile and will also tear a light bait right off the line and make every panfish feel like a wet sock. So when you see a $39 ultralight hanging next to a $200 heavy flipping stick, you are not looking at cheap versus good. You are looking at 2 completely different springs for 2 completely different jobs. Comparing their price tags is like asking why a claw hammer costs less than a sledgehammer. They are not competing. They were built to hit different things. The mistake I watch anglers make every season is buying power by the price tag instead of by the fish. A man chases crappie and bluegill all summer, then walks out with a medium-heavy rod because it felt more serious and cost more, and spends the rest of the year unable to feel a single soft bite. The rod was not wrong. It was just built for somebody else's fish. So the edge here is simple, and you can use it on your next trip to the wall. Before you look at a price, look at what you actually chase. Match the power to the fish and to the lure weight printed right there on the blank. Panfish and light jigs want ultralight to light. All-around bass wants medium to medium heavy. Big fish buried in heavy cover wants heavy. Get that one word right, and you have already outshopped 90% of the people standing at that rack. And the rod makes it easy on you, if you know where to look. Right next to that power word, in small print, are 2 little ranges, the factory stamped there, for exactly this reason. A line rating, in pounds, and a lure weight, usually in ounces. Those are not suggestions. They are the window the blank was engineered to work inside. Throw a lure heavier than the top number, and you overload the spring and kill your casting and your feel. Throw lighter than the bottom number, and the rod barely loads at all, and your distance falls off a cliff. Read those two ranges, match them to the line and the lures already in your box, and half the guessing is gone before you have even flexed the thing. But power only tells you how much the spring can lift. It says nothing about the thing you actually feel in your hands, where the rod bends. And that second word is where the real money and the real confusion lives. Take that same spring and ask a different question. Not how much it can lift, but where it bends when it does. Push on the tip of one rod, and only the top few inches flex, while the rest stays stiff. Push on another and it bends deep, halfway down the blank, like a longbow. That is action. Fast action bends up near the tip. Moderate and slow actions bend deeper and deeper toward the handle. And this is the word that actually changes what fishing feels like. A fast rod, bending only at the tip, is a stiff lever with a sensitive antenna on the end. It telegraphs the faintest tick straight into your palm, and it moves a lot of line fast the instant you set the hook. That is why the finesse crowd and the worm and jig anglers live and die on fast rods. Now here is a piece of the picture the wall never fills in, and it comes from the fish, not the factory. When a bass eats, it does not bite down like a dog. It opens its mouth and inhales. It creates a vacuum and sucks the bait in, water and all, in under 1/10 of a second. Peter Wainwright, a biologist at the University of California, Davis, has spent a career filming exactly that. Suction feeding, he calls it. And it changes what you want from a rod. Against a fish that inhales, a super-fast, super-stiff rod can rip the bait out of the strike before the fish has really taken it, or tear a treble hook loose on the first head shake. That is why crankbait and moving bait anglers swear by moderate action, a rod that bends deeper, loads slower, and lets the fish turn and go with the bait before everything comes tight. The bend, in other words, is forgiveness. So the trade is real, and once again it is not cheap versus good. Fast action buys you sensitivity and hook setting speed, and costs you forgiveness. Moderate action buys you forgiveness and treble hook staying power, and costs you a little raw feel. Neither one is better. They are built for different bites. The edge. Pick your action by how the fish eats what you are throwing. Single hooks you have to drive home. Jigs, worms, hook sets you make happen. Want fast. Treble baits and moving baits the fish eats on the run. Crankbaits, spinner baits, topwater. Want moderate. Match the bend to the bite, and you will lose fewer fish this season than any upgrade in price could ever save you. And watch what happens the first time you fish the right action for your bait. With a moving bait, that deeper bend loads up on the cast and slings the lure farther with less effort, and then it stays connected through the fight instead of pulling free on the jump. With a jig, that fast tip lets you feel the bottom change from gravel to mud through your fingertips and drive a hook home before the fish knows it made a mistake. That is not a small upgrade. That is the difference between a good day and a quiet one, and it costs you nothing but knowing which word to look for. So now you have two words, power and action. Put them together, and you can read any rod on any wall faster than a salesman can walk over to help you. Let me show you exactly how. Here is the whole skill, and it takes about 10 seconds standing at the rack. Pick up the rod. First, find the two words printed just above the handle, the power and the action. Every real rod has them. That is the manufacturer telling you, in their own words, exactly what the rod is for. Read it like the label on a medicine bottle, because that is precisely what it is. Second, flex it. Palm the tip and push, and feel where it bends. Does it break only at the very top, quick and crisp? That is your fast action, confirmed by hand. Does it bend deep and smooth, like a bow drawing back? That is moderate. You are checking the factory's word against the blank, the same thing I do to a rod before I ever hand it to a client. Third, and this is the step that changes everything, ignore the price until the first two are done, because the moment you can read power and action, the whole wall rearranges itself in front of you. That good, better, best ladder cheapest on the left, most expensive on the right? It was never a quality ladder. It is a rack of different tools wearing different price tags, and most of the climb from left to right is just paying for a heavier spring or a name that the fish you actually chase will never need. There is one more number worth a glance, and it is the easiest of all: the length, printed right on the blank in feet and inches. Think of it as leverage. A longer rod is a longer lever. It casts farther and moves more line on a hook set, but it trades away a little close-in control. A shorter rod is the opposite: less distance, more accuracy under docks and overhanging brush. For most freshwater work, something in the neighborhood of 6.5 to 7 feet is the honest all-arounder. Go longer only when you need to reach out, shorter only when you need to be precise in tight cover. So here is the whole read, start to finish, on a rod you have never held. Say it is stamped medium power, fast action, 7 feet. In 10 seconds you know this. It is an all-around base rod, built to drive a single hook home, throwing the middle range of lure weights on the line rating beside it, casting a good distance. That one rod covers jigs, worms, and soft plastics for the fish most of us chase. You did not need a salesman, and you did not need the price. You read it yourself. Do that. Power, action, length, then price. And you have quietly stepped outside the entire game the wall was built to play on you. You are no longer shopping by the sticker, you are shopping by the fish. I have put that whole read, the power chart, the action chart, and the exact match for every common freshwater fish and bait onto one page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on the screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because there is a flip side to all of this that I am not going to skip, and it is the honest one. Sometimes that $200 really is buying you something real. Here is exactly when. I am not here to tell you that every expensive rod is a con. That is the lazy version of this video, and it is not true. So let me be straight about exactly when that money buys something your hands will actually notice. There are 3 situations. Learn them, and you will never overpay, or underbuy, again. The first is feel, and only in one place: finesse. When you are fishing tiny baits for pressured, finicky fish, a light jig, a drop shot, a subtle little soft plastic, a higher-end blank is lighter and stiffer for its weight, and it telegraphs a whisper of a bite that a cheap blank can muffle. If you spend your days trying to make wary bass eat something they are not sure about, that sensitivity is real money, well spent. If you are chunking a spinnerbait or dunking worms for bluegill off the dock, you will never feel the difference, and you should not pay for it. The second is the hardware that takes a beating, the guides the line runs through, and the reel seat that holds the whole thing together. Under braided line or out in salt water, a cheap guide insert can groove and fray your line, and a cheap seat can corrode and work loose. If you fish braid hard, or fish the salt, paying up right there buys you something that simply fails less often. If you throw monofilament at largemouth in a farm pond, the budget hardware will outlast your interest in the rod. And the third is the part nobody prints on a spec sheet: consistency. A budget rod is a bit of a lottery. Most of them are perfectly fine, but every so often you will pull one from the box with a guide set a hair crooked or a soft spot in the blank. The premium builder catches more of those before they ever ship. You are not only buying the rod, you are buying a slightly better chance that this exact rod is a good one. That is real, and it is worth knowing before you gamble on the single cheapest stick on the wall. So there is the honest ledger. Finesse feel, hard-use hardware, and consistency. Those are the 3 things that money can genuinely buy you. Almost everything else you are being sold is a heavier spring, a different bend, or a name. And there is one more thing the wall is quietly selling you that has nothing to do with the rod at all. It is the fish in the photograph. Look up at the wall sometime. Really look at the pictures they hang above the rods. A largemouth the size of a football, frozen in mid-jump. A muskie as long as your arm. A trophy nobody in that store has landed in a year. Now think about the fish you actually caught the last time you went out. If you are like most of us, it had a lot less drama to it. A bluegill, a crappie, A perch off the dock with your kid. There is a gap between the fish in the photograph and the fish on your line, and the whole rod wall is arranged to sell straight into it. It is built around aspirational species, the trophies, the dream trips, because that is what moves a $200 rod off the rack. But the plain truth of American fishing is a lot quieter than the poster. The panfish, bluegill, crappie, perch, are year after year among the most caught freshwater fish in the entire country. The bluegill alone started out native to the waters east of the Rockies, and has since been introduced so widely that it now turns up almost everywhere a kid can reach a dock. And here is the part that makes the whole price wall look a little silly. For that fish, the one you actually catch, the correct rod is a cheap one, a light or an ultralight, a soft tip, 4 to 6 pound line, a small jig. That is not a compromise, it is the right tool. A bluegill bite is a faint little tap, and a light rod with a soft tip telegraphs that tap straight into your fingers, while a heavy $200 stick, built for the poster base, will feel almost nothing at all. Bring the expensive rod to the panfish, and you have brought a sledgehammer to set a wristwatch. The edge here is almost embarrassing in how simple it is. Buy the rod for the fish in your live well, not the fish in the photograph. Match it to the water you actually fish. On the ordinary Tuesday evenings you actually fish it. Do that, and you will outcatch the fellow next to you holding $300 of the wrong tool. So let's put all of it together: power, action, the honest ledger, and the fish that is really on the end of your line, and walk that wall one last time, the way you are going to walk it from now on. Here is everything, boiled down to 3 moves you can make at any rod rack in the country. Read them once, and you own this for the rest of your fishing life. 1. Pick the power by the fish, not the price. Panfish and light jigs, go ultra light to light. All-around bass, medium to medium heavy. Big fish in heavy cover, heavy. The word is printed on the blank. Read it first. 2. Pick the action by how the fish eats what you throw. Single hooks you drive home, fast action. Treble baits and moving baits the fish inhales on the run, moderate action. Match the bend to the bite. 3. Pay up only where your fishing will actually cash it in. Finesse feel, hard-use hardware for braid and salt, and a better shot at consistency. Outside those 3, the cheap rod is not a compromise. For your fishing, it is the correct tool. And let me be honest about the ceiling on all of this, because the whole point of what I do is that the honest version is the useful one. Everything I just gave you is about telling a $39 rod from a $200 one. Step all the way up to the true high end, the rods a tournament pro leans on for 8 hours a day, and there are real differences in build that a serious angler can feel. That is a different conversation for a different day. But between the cheap end of the wall and its middle, 90% of what separates those price tags is power, action, and a name. And now you can read all 3. So go back to those 2 rods from the very beginning, the $39 one and the $200 one, 40 feet apart behind the glass. 20 minutes ago, one of them just looked cheap, and the other just looked good. Now you can pick either one up, read the 2 words above the handle, flex the tip against your palm, and know in about 10 seconds which one your fishing actually needs, and it might be either one. The price tag was never going to tell you that. The number was there to make the decision for you. I have handed a lot of rods across a lot of boats, and the anglers who fish best have almost never been the ones who spent the most. They are the ones who knew exactly what they were holding, and why. That is all I have done here. Put the reading of a rod back into your hands, so the wall can no longer do it for you. If you would rather fish knowing what the price tag will never tell you, then you already know which side of this you are standing on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light. One rod, one cast, one quiet piece of the truth at a time.